Do things make us as much as we make things? Could the wearing of a pair of gold dance shoes in a non-dance environment, like I'm doing right now, be seen as a form of everyday activism? I'm going to talk about fashion at the border crossing, the geographical, as in migration, and the social, as in the crossing of society's imaginary borders founded on racial, cultural, and gendered difference. I'm going to talk to you about fashion as a way of speaking, about ourselves and the way we want to be seen. In a nutshell, I'm going to talk about disobedient dress. What inspires me is the theatre of fashion, the crafting and performance of identities through props, such as a neatly pressed suit, or a hat deliberately placed to one side, or a particular favourite dress, or the strategic mixing of print and pattern. I am fascinated by fashion's potential to transform. So we're going to think about style, about swagger, about showing off. My story begins with a case of mistaken identity. About 20 years ago, when I was still in my 30s, I was working as the principal designer for a lifestyle brand known globally for selling the English look. And as part of this particular role, I'd have to meet with various fashion editors, attend different industry events, speak with a number of fashion people. And to be honest, I always felt quite uncomfortable about doing this. Then a colleague from our Boston office, who was over in London on sabbatical at the time, said to me in passing one day, "It's so great that you're head of design, because, let's face it, you're not exactly an English rose." And I was so shocked. I can honestly say I'd never noticed that before. And this set me on a mission to think about how our assumptions about race, culture, and gender are constructed. How, as humans, we constantly speak, visually and verbally. How we constantly read, and sometimes misread, these visual and verbal texts. Her comment got me thinking about the way that fashion functions. A throwaway remark literally changed the course of my life, and it led me to embark on what I now realize is over 15 years of research, not just into the relationship between fashion and racial, cultural, and gendered identity, but more importantly to me, fashion as a way of pushing back against invisibility, stereotyping, and the erasure of personhood. Society's imaginary borders are largely founded on hierarchies of value rooted in very negative readings of difference. And this is the problem. We internalize these borders, and they become psychological boundaries that then have the potential to harm us, to rein us in. It's no accident that in most societies, the taking away of a person's freedom is often accompanied by the taking away of their clothing. Think about enslavement, for example. The process of enslavement in the Caribbean began with capture in Africa and what was termed seasoning. The stripping of the newly enslaved, the removal of all clothing, the shaving of heads, marked the transition from subject to object. You might remember the John Boyne book and subsequent film, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. The story is about the Holocaust. Bruno, a German boy, discovers and befriends Samuel, a Jewish boy, living behind a barbed wire fence that Bruno believes is surrounding a farm. He also believes that Samuel is wearing a pair of striped pajamas. Of course, we know that the farm is actually a concentration camp, and that the striped pajamas are Samuel's prison garb. So in a sense, the Jews were also stripped. I want to come back to the example of enslavement. Ralph Ellison, in the prologue to The Invisible Man, writes, "I am the invisible man simply because people refuse to see me." What Ellison is writing about is the invisibility of those of us in the African diasporas. He's referring to the effects of being viewed from behind a colonial lens that fixes him as something other than human, a colonial gaze that renders him invisible. He's writing about the racialized visual field and the way that society's hierarchies based on racial and cultural difference operate. You see, when Europe colonized the Caribbean, it brought its own language systems, ideas, beliefs, cultural expressions with it, and it tried to fit the Caribbean into that framework, to read and represent it from its own viewpoint, using its own cultural language. And in some ways, this is not unusual because we all draw on what we already know and understand to read and represent that which we don't. Of course, the issue here is that the encounter between Europe and the Caribbean was not an equal one. There were hierarchies of power at play. Traces of these remain even today. We see them in representations, or perhaps misrepresentations, of us in the media. And they're often framed by two polar opposite stereotypes. So African diaspora women, for example, black women, are seen as either asexual. Think of the mammy figure in popular culture, like Hattie McDaniels playing the maid in Gone with the Wind. Or we're seen as overtly sexual. Think of Nicki Minaj, or fictional characters like Foxy Brown. Remember Foxy Brown? I don't know how she managed to be quite so ridiculously sexy whilst trying to run down the hoodlums that had just murdered her government agent boyfriend. The individuals in each case are rendered invisible. Racial and cultural difference is oversimplified. There are no nuances. You see, the Enlightenment set in motion these systems of evaluation and representation. A major downside to the age of discovery and our need to name and categorize is that standards of comparison emerged. So us and them, us and the other. Okay, so where does fashion fit into all of this? Fashion is part of the process by which the unequal distribution of power within society is constructed, maintained, and experienced as legitimate. But fashion can also be used to challenge and contest one's position within society. So by evoking this idea of disobedient dress, I'm suggesting that fashion might also become a way of resisting society's at times limited, and therefore limiting, expectations of us. And in this way, it's as though the body becomes a site of protest. The border itself, a space of transformation. Imagine what it would be like. Imagine what would happen if we stopped thinking of society's imaginary borders as the moment when we're reined in, as the point when everything ceases. What might it be like to think of society's imaginary borders as the point at which something begins? If we open the border out so it becomes a space. If we stretch it out so it becomes a borderland space, an in-between space beyond the mainstream where rigid pigeonholes and stereotypes no longer exist, and we have the possibility to re-evaluate ourselves, to refashion ourselves. It's a little bit like going to carnival. Have you ever noticed that during carnival, you put on a costume, feathers, sequins, a dragon's head, batty riders, whatever, and we sense a freedom to become whoever we want to be. We can become a bigger version of ourselves. We're energized, empowered. It's not that we completely disappear. We're still there inside the costume. You see, carnival is a kind of borderland space. It's the space in between reality and fantasy, like a twilight zone. And our carnival self is our transformed, made bigger, larger-than-life self. It's the costume. The costume allows us to reveal something of our inner beings that might actually be at odds with what other people expect of us. I guess you might be wondering why I have this beaten-up old suitcase with me. Well, this beaten-up old suitcase is actually my father's grip, made of cardboard. And it's the suitcase that he carried with him when he traveled from Jamaica to England in 1956, crossing a geographical border, dressed up in his Sunday best suit, moving from one life to another, from one sense of being to another. These white gloves belong to my mother. I'm sure that many of us here are children of migrants, and there are such memories embedded in these objects. We learn at a very early age from our parents the importance of being well dressed as a way of showing respect for ourselves and to others. In fact, we're often well dressed to the point of being overdressed. But this is not the way we're expected to look as migrants. Yet for us, we might only have a few pennies in our pockets, but we have to look good. The only way to dress is up. It's about dignity, about personhood. And the same goes for the Isikatani. Conspicuous consumption taken to the absolute max. The Isikatani are mainly young men who have grown up in the former South African townships, and they're typically 15, 16, 17 years old. Do you remember how you were at that age? Trying to work out who you were, what you were going to do with your life, rebelling against your parents' generation. I remember being young when the punk movement began. I was never going to be confident enough to become a punk. I wanted to get my grades, and besides, I was far too worried about what my Jamaican parents might think. So I became a new romantic. Sadly, I don't have any photographs to show you. Or luckily, I don't have any photographs to show you. So where the punks customized t-shirts, tartan, and bondage gear, the Isikatani rebel by disobediently wearing Italian designer brands, mismatched shoes, gold teeth, crossing society's borders founded on wealth and class in a South African context where class and colour become conflated. They are masters in the art of showing off. I like to think of them as elegant anarchists. The model Philomena, relishing her sensuality, challenging our assumptions about body aesthetic, about who is allowed to be sensual and show their skin. Lastly, I absolutely love the work of photographer Gavin Fernandez, and he, for me, seems to blur every single social border going, taking the notion of elegant anarchy to another level again. If we are wily about the way that we use fashion, it will allow us to reveal something of our inner selves, to push back against stereotypes, and to say to society, here I am, this is me, deal with it. But you know, I often feel that as women in particular, we hide behind a cloak of invisibility. It's as though we're happy to shrink, to disappear into the background. There's absolutely nothing enlightened in shrinking. And I believe that we each possess a creative spark that might ignite the way that we present ourselves in everyday life. These gold shoes are the soul of my outfit. They're my disobedient object. So why conform to the person that society tells you to be and to look the way that society tells you to look? Why not be disobedient and embrace your uniqueness instead? Why not rebel a little? No, why not rebel a lot? Thank you.